Okay, thank you so much. So first, I want to say thank you to the World Affairs Council of Charlotte for having me. I want to welcome all the students. Do your homework. So, I got interested in international affairs because I had a wonderful social studies teacher in 9th grade named Mrs. Hauser. She's now known as Dr. Hauser. She came to my high school reunion, and it turns out that one of the board members here and I went to the same high school. Fairly close in age, no. But we had a number of teachers, but she did not have Dr. Hauser, who was my 9th grade social studies teacher, and then I had her husband, Mr. Hauser, who was my 10th grade, and my senior year, I think 10th grade, maybe it was my 11th grade European history teacher. So I saw both of them at a reunion maybe about 18 months ago, and they had a big positive impact on me. So I'm really glad we have high school students here. I'm glad you're all here. And I'm going to talk about a couple of things. So first, I just want to say that this is a wonderful city. I've never been to Charlotte before, and I'm so impressed. What a booming, what an interesting city. You guys are all very globally connected in many, many ways. We're interdependent with the rest of the world, and Charlotte is an example of that. You have many global companies that are here that are setting up their operations here. You have a banking center, as well as North Carolina is a state with many industries that are tied to the world. So it's very appropriate that you have such a strong World Affairs Council, and it's great. And so I'm so pleased to be here. I do want to start with so there's like a lot of bad stuff in the news, and so I'm not going to try and minimize that. There's a lot of difficult and challenging things, but I want us to think for a minute about the levels of overall. We take a little bit of a step back and we look from, say, about 1950 or 1945. We say, okay, is the world a healthier place? The answer is yes. Is the world a somewhat wealthier place? There's problems with that. There's things like inequality that can be particularly problematic. But is the world a wealthier place than, say, 1950 or 1980 or even 20 years ago? And even including in developing countries, the answer to that is yes. Is the world a more educated place? So if you look at the metrics about things like how many girls are in school or how many years of study that people do, including in some of the world's poorest countries, you'll see the numbers have increased. So the world's a more educated place. How many cell phones are there in the world? Right? I don't even tell you that, right? I've got 2. But if you go to a continent like Africa, there's some, I don't know, one of the students can Google how many cell phones are there in Africa, and you guys can tell. Can one of the students do that for me, please? How many? I'm guessing it's 700 million. But you guys tell me. In Africa. So you tell me. How many cell phones? We're all more connected than even 20 years ago. I also would argue, how many? That's pretty good, right? Pretty good, right? It's like I do this for a living, right? Okay. So, the world's more connected.
Thank you.
The other thing I think is important is the world's freer in a lot of ways. So you may say, okay, well, maybe that's not, looking at sort of the state of American democracy or what have you. You guys you'll tell me about, we do have some problems in our American democracy. We can probably talk about that. But I would just say that if you look at, okay, how many authoritarian governments are there? How many people are under dictatorships? And how many are kind of more democracies? There's net, if you go back to even say 1980, there's more democracies. So the world there's lots of people who do this for a living. We'll tell you about, there's this concept called democratic backsliding. So there may be ostensibly democratic countries that have become kind of slipped, and there's lots of problems. There's all sorts of, so people who do this for a living will say there's lots of trouble. But if you said, okay, from 1980 to today, is the world a freer place? I would argue the world's a freer place, and that there are more people living under democracy. But there's other things too. If you look at, I think it's the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I think it's this year. Maybe it's 75th. I think it's 75th. So that has spawned the whole concept of human rights. So if you've ever heard of Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch, there's a whole series of these organizations. It's a lot harder to treat people horribly today, but because of cell phones, because of organizations like that, because of sort of these norms, and that even countries that don't necessarily, want to know that they have to kind of watch out for that stuff. So it's also a world that there's like a higher level of accountability. So what I wanted to say first is that yes, there's like go read the newspaper and then you want to just cry, right? There's like terrible, it's frustrating, it's discouraging. But I would say that there's even with all of these negative things, there's been significant incremental progress over, say, if you look at a 20-year timeline, or a 40-year timeline, or a 70-year timeline. That's required a couple of things. I think one of the things that's required is not having a third world war, right? So wars are really bad for progress. So we haven't had a third world war, right? We've had wars, we've had terrible wars, and wars are a terrible thing, violence is a terrible thing, but we haven't had a World War I or World War II, maybe like where something like, some horrific number of people died, and it's hard to quantify, and you say these numbers in the millions, and it's numbing. But it's not, we haven't had that, and so it's allowed for all of these things to happen. It's allowed for deeper connectivity with the world. I think the other thing that's required is someone's had to lead it. Someone's had to push. So if you look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, well, who was the lead on that? That was Eleanor Roosevelt, right? People know, right? Eleanor Roosevelt was the lead on that. So someone had to stand up and say, this is important, we're going to push on that. There's also, I would say, someone had to stand up and say, we're going to work on trying to support democracies and people who want more democratic governance in the world. So Winston Churchill was involved with that. Ronald Reagan gave a famous speech in Westminster in 1982. And it was a bipartisan project in Congress with Democratic Congressman named Dante Fascio and other people to support sort of a consistent support for people who wanted to have more democratic societies. And I think democracies are a good thing, and we should work towards having, my fingers on this bill, having more democracy, more human rights, less corruption. These are all good things for the world. So someone's had to push. Someone had to kind of support, kind of providing kind of a security umbrella. And I would argue the United States has done a lot of that. And someone's had to push on some of these things, often kind of as a supporting actor, but someone's had to do it. There's also been a series of other kinds of collective action things that were set up. There's the United Nations was set up as a collective action exercise to do with peace. And there were a series of institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, which were set up to try and do a collective action around rebuilding Europe and later rebuilding poor countries, as well as sort of being a global fire response unit for kind of financial crises. That's what the IMF does. I know in Mission Impossible, there's IMF. You guys have been watching Mission, but there's IMF. This is another IMF. And then there have been a series of about 100 or so multilateral institutions, organizations where different states come together to solve problems. There's what's called the World Food Program. So if you have like a big famine and there's starving people, they go and provide food. And so they collect food from different countries, including the United States, when they stop famines from happening. And then you've got organizations, you have other sort of more obscure organizations, but are very important as well. All of this is to say that there's been it's required though somebody to push and someone what I would describe as pay the condo fees to pay, like in collect, who lives in a condominium? How about the students? Any of the students live in a condominium? You know what a condominium is? You ever heard of a homeowners association? Okay, so HOA, okay. Or apartment, you guys live in an apartment? People live in an apartment maybe? So if you live in an apartment or you live in like a community of houses, you pay like collective things like security, you pay someone to cut the grass, you pay a collective bill for the electricity and the water bill. These are kind of the collective costs. So in the world, we have collective costs. And so someone has to kind of go around and cover some of the costs. So some countries have taken on a larger burden than others. And I would argue that the United States has been a significant contributor, investor, and leader in sort of taking on sort of these bigger collective costs, whether it's security, whether it's food, whether it's running the World Bank a certain way, or running the IMF. So at the same time, the good news is there's been lots of development, and there have been lots of countries that have begun to get wealthier. We've had, we've had freer countries, healthier countries, wealthier countries. So many of them have been able to join kind of the collective system of countries and are able to do what Mike was described as burden sharing. So Poland is a country that's now pretty wealthy and is able to provide, has a military and sends peacekeepers and is a foreign aid provider. You have countries like the Marshall Plan, which is a famous thing, which helped rebuild Europe. The United States put who are the high school students who've heard of the Marshall Plan? Can I see? Okay, that's you get an A. But the other students, have you heard of the Marshall Plan? Okay, so the adults know what the Marshall Plan is, but the Marshall Plan was a major initiative to rebuild Europe after World War II. And it was really important. But we didn't just do it because we thought it was the good thing to do. We did think it was a good thing to do. We did it because we were in a period of, unfortunately, sort of geopolitical tensions with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was a real thing, and it was a really bad thing. So I know you guys are too young in high school, so it was bad. They were bad, and it was a bad thing. And people who lived under communism will tell you it was bad. So we saw that there was the beginning of a Cold War, and so as a result, we sort of got afraid and said we're going to have to engage in the world, not only because it's the right thing to do, but because if we did it, some of these countries might go communist or be taken over by the Soviet Union, and that would be a bad thing for a whole bunch of reasons. So there's a concept called enlightened self-interest. So it's like a big think tank word, right? So what that means is you do something because it's the right thing to do, but it's also in your interest to do so. So we did the Marshall Plan out of enlightened self-interest. We also, in the 1960s, there was an important book. So after you guys read my book, and I hope you all go out and buy it retail and read it cover to cover, and there'll be a quiz the next time I see you. There's a really important book that I hope all the high school students go out and read because it's still relevant. It's called The Ugly American. The Ugly American. So who here has read The Ugly American? Read it. Okay, heard of it is one thing. So 1, 2, 3. Okay, 3 people. Okay, so if you're over to the age of 65, there's a very high probability. Sorry to be a narc on you or how you person, but if you're over the age of 65, there's a higher probability you read the book. If you're under the age of 65, you may have kind of heard of it. But it's probably the most important book, I would argue, of the second half of the 20th century. It's the most important foreign policy book of the second half of the 20th century. More important than there's a book called President the Creation, much more important. And Henry Kissinger is a very famous Secretary of State who's on our board at CSIS, the think tank. More important than any book he wrote. It's called The Ugly American. It sold 3 million copies from 1958 to in sort of like a 5 or 6 year period at a time when the country was half the size it is now. So think about what a bestseller that was. John F. Kennedy, I told people this at dinner last night, was so shocked that about what we talked about in the book, basically saying that the United States didn't really understand like poor countries. We didn't speak those foreign languages. We didn't have kind of some cultural sensitivities. We weren't kind of like responding to their hopes and aspirations, and that the Chinese communists and the Soviet Union were much better at this than us, and we were getting our butts kicked. And so he was so freaked out. He was senator at the time. He bought 100 copies and gave one to every member of the U.S. Senate. And when he became president, he did 5 things. He reformed our foreign assistance through the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961. He put the best American media communicator to run something called the U.S. Information Agency, which is a way of like communicating with the rest of the world. He started something called the Peace Corps. People have heard of the Peace Corps. He started because of that book. He started something called the Green Berets, something you may have also heard of, which is like a special forces that deals with like working with local communities and tries to get on side with local communities, but it's a military organization. And then he had something, a positive, forward-looking agenda that spoke to the hopes and aspirations of friends and potential friends in Latin America, called the Alliance for Progress. And it's very well remembered in Latin America. So if I fast forward to today, so I would argue that we did all those things. John F. Kennedy did all those things because it was the right thing to do. But he did all those things because we were in a Cold War with the Soviet Union. Fidel Castro had taken over Cuba, right, in 1959. Richard Nixon was vice president, visited Venezuela, and was almost killed in a riot. And people were shocked in Washington that maybe Venezuela was going to go communist. And they said, well, we ought to do something about it. And they said, well, let's start a regional development bank. And so there's something called the Inter-American Development Bank. Who's the Inter-American Development Bank? Anyway, okay. That was not started not because of like, this is a nice thing to do. This was started because we had a geopolitical challenge. So it was a form of what I described earlier as enlightened self-interest. Okay. So fast forward to today. So we're in a world where I would say, in many parts of the United States, so I've done 85 world talks. I haven't, so I think there's a sense in some parts of the United States, both political parties, and I think there's somewhat more in the Republican Party, that there's a desire to take a vacation from global leadership. There's a temptation for the United States to say, this is really heavy. This is hard. We can't afford this. This is heavy. I don't want to do this anymore. Why do I have to do this? Right? So sometimes, like working out, or I don't have to go to the gym. I have to do these things. I would just say that there's a series of burdens that the United States has carried for a long time, and the world has been a beneficiary of that. The world's freer, healthier, wealthier, and more educated. Not because only us, but we've been a pusher. We've been a leader. We've led coalitions of others to do a lot of this. I would argue that's the truth, and I think other people would agree with me. So we're in a period where there's some kind of vacillation, not sure whether we want to do this or not. And at the same time, we're in a new moment. So I grew up, in 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. And that was the end of sort of the official Cold War, sort of 89 to 91, you could say that. So I was 17 in 1989. And so really from like 17 years old until I'd say about 2015 was sort of a period of whatever that is, more than 25 years, or probably 30 years, of the, what's called the post-Cold War era. And so people can debate what you would call, but I would argue we're in a new age. We're in a new age. We're not in the post-Cold War age anymore. We could say we're in the post-Cold War, but that doesn't kind of capture like the world that way. What we're in is, and so H.R. McMaster, who was a three-star general, but he was also the National Security Advisor. He's a very, very smart man. Was the author of a national security strategy in 2017, described it as an age of great power competition. So we have a challenge. We have a challenge with Vladimir Putin's murderous regime in Russia. We don't have a problem with the Russian people, so let me start with that. So if you hear me say the word Russia, I want you to think Dan means Vladimir Putin's murderous regime in Russia. We also have a challenge now with the Chinese Communist Party. That's different than having a problem with the Chinese people. So if you hear me say the word China today, I'm not saying we have a problem with the Chinese people. But you're going to hear, I want you to understand that we have a challenge with the government of China, and we have a challenge with the government of Russia. And we need to find ways to engage the Chinese people and have good working relations with Chinese people. And we need to have good working relations, I'm going to say this a little bit more controversially, with Russian people. So we need to have, I actually am in favor of having more Russian students study in the United States. We're not doing enough of that. And we need to find ways to work with folks who are working against the Putin regime, who are exiles, and we need to find ways to do that. So I think that's a conversation. But I want to argue in this age of great power competition that most of this competition is not going to play out in China. Most of this competition is going to play out in Russia. It's not going to play out in the United States. It's going to play out in Latin America. It's going to play out in Africa. It's going to play out in South Asia. It's going to play out in Southeast Asia. It's going to play out in the Pacific Island states. It's going to play out in Central Asia. It's going to play out in Ukraine and Moldova. So for this conversation, I'm going to describe it as the global South, right? The global South, it's not really a precise term. Like my title of the book is Soft Power. What the heck does that mean, right? I'm sure you're like, what does it mean by soft power? So that's an imprecise term too. You can ask me, what do you mean by soft power? As a high school student, if you guys are still here, you can ask me, what's soft power? And global South is not really a really good term. It's like not a very precise term, but I think for this conversation as a shorthand, I'm going to ask you guys to let me use the term global South. And what I would argue is even with the newspaper and the news that's happening in the last week in various parts of the world, I would argue most of this competition, God willing, is not going to be a military competition. Though I think the United States needs to have a strong military, and our allies and partners need to have a strong military. And we need to have deterrence in places, in my view, in places like Taiwan, and we're going to need to have a different level of deterrence in a place like Ukraine. But most of this competition is not going to play out in the military realm. Most of this competition is going to play out in the non-military realm. It's going to play out in things like trade. It's going to play out in things like technology and technology standards. It's going to play out in things like values. It's going to play out in things like whose vaccine you use. It's going to play out in things like who leads and who influences this multilateral system I was describing earlier. What kind of infrastructure and who builds it, and the kinds of the arrangements around debt, and in terms of how where people go and get educated and long-term training. So I asked two questions. We were having a discussion last night. I've traveled to 80 countries for my work. I've come up with two questions that are sort of my shorthand questions to ask countries when I meet them. I say, where do you buy your weapons from? So if they say I buy them from Russia, I'm like, okay, I know who they're going to vote with. When these UN votes on Ukraine, for example, a lot of countries will say, well, I buy my guns from the Russians, and so I'm with them. It's kind of a crappy excuse. And why does that matter? When you buy a weapon system, you're buying spare parts. You're buying more bullets from them that fit the thing, right? You also have experts that come and work on the stuff. You send your people to Moscow to get trained up. And often, let's agree, like, okay, so for example, Colombia, which is has been historically, in the last 30 years, a really good ally of the United States, they use Russian helicopters. Why? The Russian helicopters are like the Honda Accords of helicopters. They're like they're really tall mountains in Colombia. So the Soviet Russian helicopters can go really, really high. So whoever it is, I don't know if it's the army, likes them because they can go really high and they're kind of cheap and you can bang them around. Whereas ours are like kind of like the Cadillac, and they don't go so high, and they've got more expensive parts. And so Russia had even before the new government in Colombia, which it's kind of a leftist, kind of not great government, I'm not super happy with them. They had 100 Russian advisors in Colombia to kind of fix the helicopters. Now, do we think all 100 of those advisors were really fixing the helicopters? Can we all look at you high school students? Do you think all 100 of those people were really fixing the helicopters? No, right? Can we agree on that? Okay, so, all right. So the first question I ask is, where do you buy your weapon systems from? So when I was in Bangladesh 6 months ago, and I said, why do you guys vote the wrong way in the UN on Ukraine? Because they're voting down. They're voting against Ukraine in the UN. And so we buy our weapons from the Russians, and so we kind of owe it to them. I'm like, well, those weapon systems, if you look at them, they've like broken sorts of problems in this war too. Like, maybe that's not such a good thing. But the second question I ask is, where do you send your most gifted students to study? So if they say I'm sending them to Beijing, like in the Pacific Island states, or if you send them to, say, Central Asia or Africa, because there's really fine universities in China. There are many universities and many fine ones. And I was asking last night, how much does it cost if you're an out-of-state student to study at UNC Chapel Hill for a year? What do you guys think in high school? What do the high school students think? How much does it cost? $50,000. Yeah, right, $50,000. How much does it cost to go to the finest university in China, Tsinghua, for a year? 5? 10. Let's say 10. Okay. So 50 or 10? So that's a lot more students, right? So you're seeing many, many people in poor countries now going to learn engineering, other really important technical functions. So what you want, though, we want people to come study in the United States, I think. We're still the lead country for people to study abroad as the United States. Someone was telling me I was trying to figure out how many, I'd be curious about how many international students in total is in the UNC public school system, public university system. And I think we were talking earlier, there's 20,000 Chinese students in the UNC system. That's a good thing. That's a good thing, by the way. Okay, so we're in this new age of great power countries. So we have a competition, and so my view is things like, who's heard of the Belt and Road? Who's heard of Belt and Road? How about the high school students? You heard of Belt and Road? Okay, sort of, maybe. Okay. Belt and Road is an awesome idea. The problem is it's not our idea. It's a great idea. I talked earlier about we need to have a positive, forward-looking agenda that speaks to the hopes and aspirations of our friends and potential friends. China has that. It's called Belt and Road. It's a great idea. I'm angry because it's not our idea. It's a great idea, it's just not ours, it's theirs. And people love it because it speaks to their country's hopes and aspirations. So we can't fight, my message to high school students is like, we can't fight something with nothing. We can't say to people, don't take the Chinese Communist Party vaccines if we're not going to find a way to them to get an alternative. Don't take, there's a really good telephone company that's price competitive and quality competitive called Huawei. And there's a whole bunch of national security concerns about it, at least in the United States, we're very concerned about it. We can't go to poor countries and say, don't take the Huawei system if we don't enable an alternative. We also shouldn't be saying to people, look, so we need to be able to speak to people's hopes and aspirations because the world has changed even from 15 years ago. In Washington, we talk a lot about the Chinese Communist Party-led military as being what's called a near-peer competitor. This is like a fancy national security term. It means like they've got a military that's kind of rising as a power and is a near-peer military. I would argue that the Chinese Communist Party is a near-peer soft power competitor. So what do I mean by soft power? So think of it as like everything that's not military. So it's like some of it's diplomacy, some of it's things like health, probably paying for supporting health or responding to emergencies or building infrastructure, supporting democracy and human rights, leading in the multilateral system. Some of it's about long-term training. Okay, so the reason I'm telling you all this is that we need to get our act together. So the United States needs to do a better job. We can't fight something. My message to you for especially high school students is like, we need to do a better job. We got our act together when we had a geopolitical challenge at the beginning of the Cold War with the Marshall Plan. We got our act together during the height of the Cold War with John F. Kennedy saying there's this thing called the ugly American. We have got to get our act together in dealing with the global South in a better way. And when we did, we had sort of a bipartisan consensus for about 15 years after kind of Kennedy set this up. we've had kind of smaller mini versions of this. We're going to need a bipartisan consensus on how we're going to engage with the rest of the world in a way that's a positive, forward-looking agenda that speaks to the hopes and aspirations of our friends and potential friends. Not only because it's the right thing to do, because if we don't, there's a big challenge. And I think the challenge is, I said at the beginning, that, look, there have been a whole bunch of things that have had progress, and a few things about, but if you care, this is my view. Maybe you'll agree, maybe you won't agree with me, but I think most of you are going to agree. So I want you to each think about things that you most care about in the world. The things like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of association, choices about where you want to live in the world, who you want to be with, the most personal choices you want to make, environmental stewardship, economic stability, which we all kind of take for granted, maybe even peace in the world. So who would be a better steward? So someone's got to lead, is my view. Someone's got to pay the condo fees. So far, the United States, in partnership with a coalition of others, have done that. I would like it so that your grandkids, that's still the case. And I want you to do a thought experiment and think, okay, well, what if some other coalition of folks were leading that? That included countries like Vladimir Putin's Russia, or the dictatorship in Cuba, or the mullahs in Iran, right? That's not so great. I think if you thought about it, say, I don't know if I want sort of a system where like the rules are set. The rules have to be set by somebody. So I think I prefer the current arrangement. So the various things that I've discussed are kind of like the building blocks of a system, like a Lego set, right? Like different pieces of a system. And so what I'm saying is, like, if we don't get our act together, some other coalition has the ability to fill that space. And the consequences we're not going to, at least in the United States, we're not going to like. Now, I've done this 85 times. I haven't had anybody in an American audience say to me yet, that would be great. I would really like the US to stop, leading a coalition. And I'd really like some other country to do that instead. Now, maybe someone's going to tell me I'm wrong. Whoever that person will be the first out of 85 conversations to tell me I'm wrong. But I haven't had that. I've had a couple people in the Global South do that just to kind of tweak me, but they don't really mean it, I don't think. I think they just want to say that because they have a grievance or they're unhappy about something. It's like, okay, so let me say one last thing in this stuff. So we are a very flawed vessel, right? I think all of you could go on and maybe take out a piece of paper and say all the problems of the United States. You guys, even high school students, like, you got some challenges, right? We're an imperfect society. So Eleanor Roosevelt led a coalition in 1948 to put together the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. At the time, we had straight up structural racism in the United States. But they pushed, if you look at it, it says everybody's created, should be treated the same, it should be created equal. Someone had to do it. There's still corruption in the United States. Corruption's kind of like cholesterol. Like, we have corruption in this country. You guys can say, well, this is corrupt or this is bad. Someone had to go and lead a coalition to try and get people to say corruption's not such a good thing. And that was started with something called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Right? And so there have been a whole series of international agreements on corruption. So are we still corrupt? Do we still have high cholesterol levels at times? Yeah, we need to work on it. Yeah, we do. Someone had to do it. So we're a flawed vessel. So no, I'm not saying we're not flawed. Doesn't say we haven't made mistakes. But someone's got to lead. And I would argue that it's in our interest for us to continue to lead. And that if we don't lead, there are now folks who have the capacity and the will to change the current arrangements. And if you thought about it for a minute, you'd say, actually, for a second, I'm not sure that's such a good idea. And so far, I haven't anyone said in an American audience, like, that would be awesome. I'd love it if the Chinese Communist Party set the rules on environmental stewardship, religious freedom, freedom of association, jobs, choices about my most personal decisions in my life, democracy, economic stewardship, or peace. I haven't had anyone yet tell me that. So I wrote this book to start a national conversation about that I think most of this is going to be non-military. We need to get our act together. I'm optimistic that we ultimately will. So I want everyone, especially students, like, okay, there's lots of downer stuff in the world, and I'm guardedly optimistic. I know you guys all have to go. Thanks for coming. So don't be pessimistic. I'm a guarded optimist. It's going to be okay. And let me tell you why. So let me tell you one of the reasons why I'm optimistic. So if you've ever been out, many of you may not have traveled outside the country. If you go to an American embassy, there's a really long line outside of that embassy. And they all want to come to America. So America gets the best people. They all want to come here. And they come in different ways. So here's a final question. Who do you know in this audience? Is anybody who's moving to Moscow in the next 12 months? Anybody here moving to Moscow from Charlotte? Please, I'd like to see a hand. I don't see any hands. Who's moving to Beijing next year? Anybody moving to Beijing? Why is that? So ultimately, if it's a competition for talent and people, we're going to be okay. And so as long as there's a long line outside American embassies, we'll be okay. That's my message. So thanks. I'll take questions.
Thank you, Dan. We're going to do this rapid fire so we can get as many questions in as we can. Be succinct, put a question mark at the end. The Harding folks had to head out. The Myers Park folks are still here. If I could maybe succinctly put what I think the question from Harding folks was, what are you telling your 3 kids, who I think you still have some influence over, as far as what is important for success in life? We'll get the question from Myers Park.
You have to do your homework and eat your vegetables.
Well, then we'll let you expand on that a bit. Let's answer both questions at the same time. Myers Park, who's asking the question? Please stand up, tell us who you are, and fire the question.
Hi, I'm Walker Wilson with Myers Park. So my question is, obviously a think tank comes up with solutions and ideas. How exactly, obviously there's a lot of conflict going on with the government right now. How exactly do you get a solution by, or get something passed, or get something done when our government has trouble agreeing on even the simple things?
Okay.
That's a great question.
And something more than just eat your vegetables on first.
Say your prayers and go to bed early. So I'd say a couple things. So I think you're right. We have a lot of political problems in Washington. We have political problems, I think, in the State House here. I think there's some good luck here. So I would say a couple of things. I think that, unfortunately, so in the case of the Marshall Plan, we had never, done that before. We had kind of like an isolationist streak. We were kind of protected by 2 oceans before kind of Pearl Harbor. We had, we were complicated. There's stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. But I would say, at the time, I think it was Harry Truman who was president, said we're going to have to scare the hell out of the American people. So I think, unfortunately, fear can be a healthy thing. Like if I have like too high of a cholesterol and the doctor says your cholesterol's too high and you have you're overweight and you need to do something about it. It's fear, unfortunately, can be a positive spur for change. So I think in the case of competition with China, there's a significant amount of real fear. And so we have to be careful that we don't overshoot, because I think we should make people who are Asian American feel welcome in the United States. And so there were times during COVID where there was like Asian American discrimination. That's how we treat everybody in this country is watched around the world. So we have to be really careful. But I do think we need to understand that this is that is enough to get people to do some positive things. So I would say, I was not in the Trump administration. I had a lot of interactions with people in the Trump administration. And so the argument that would get them to do what I would describe as like the right thing, I was describing to you guys earlier, I'm an influencer, right? Sorry, I can't believe I'm saying this, I'm an influencer. Was, are you okay with ceding this specific area of importance to us to China? And the answer always was no. So that meant leading in the multilateral system, that meant reauthorizing the Export-Import Bank, it meant fixing they came in saying we're gonna get rid of the Export-Import Bank, which was a super dumb idea. And then I helped kind of change their minds, and that's one of the reasons why I ended up chairing that committee that you were on with me as a reward for kind of helping them fix that. They were gonna get rid of so I would also say, so I think fear, unfortunately, is one way to kind of get people to get their act together. I think the same thing with Ukraine is a little bit like that, though I'm worried, I'm worried about supporting the Republican Party for Ukraine. And I've been spending a little bit of my free time specifically on that issue. And so what I would say is that we need to understand that what's happening in Ukraine is not just about Ukraine. There are other countries who are watching and saying, well, if this is an acceptable enough price, well, maybe I could invade some other place. So what we want is it to be a really unacceptable price. So I was talking about this at dinner last night. So the Soviet Union, Russia invaded Finland in the 1930s, and they had their teeth kicked in. And so you may get, if you give a Russian like a couple shots of vodka, they're like, yeah, I really want to get Finland, I want to take it back. But they never do it because they had their butts kicked. What I want is for the Russians to have such a bad experience in Ukraine that they may, if you give them a couple shots of vodka, say, oh yeah, I really want Ukraine, blah, 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 blah. But they're not going to do it. And we want Ukraine to be strong enough and militarily that the Russians like, ooh, that was such a bad experience, I'm going to take a rest. I'm going to take a vacation from trying to invade Ukraine for 100 years. We want them to stop. So I think big crises, unfortunately look at this thing in Israel, there was a hold up on confirming the US ambassador to Israel. Well now, people, probably Republicans in the Senate were holding it up. Now, look what happened. They've set a date for the hearing, right? Even they realize they've made a mistake. So I think crises are bad and crises are scary, but they're also moments of clarity. And so I think also who we run for president matters. So who becomes the Republican nominee matters. Who's the Democratic nominee matters. So elections have consequences, and so I think it's important to support Republicans and Democrats who believe that we need to be responsible leaders in the world. And so I use my time and effort outside of the office on things like that in my personal capacity. So if you have a member of Congress who you're young enough, you're old enough, if you wanted to volunteer in somebody's campaign, Republican or Democrat, that person was a responsible person, you should get involved in that campaign, you should volunteer. You're all in a democracy, you have a responsibility to participate, and so I suspect there's some very serious people, very serious elected officials who go to the Congress or go to the Senate. If you like them, you should support them. If you don't like them, you should support somebody else. But one of the things I look for is are they responsible in the international arena?
So we're going to try to squeeze in 3 questions. This gentleman just left. We're going to go right here to Demont Clark for a question. Then we're going to the back to Bill McNamara, who may have some high school tales to tell. And then lastly, Michael Hahn. Michael, if we could maybe call on you for a question at some point. As the third questioner, Michael is the president of the Carolinas Chinese Chamber of Commerce. So, Dumont.
Should the United States be doing more unilaterally to exercise soft power as opposed to doing it strictly through multilateral organizations? Some of our near peer whatever are taking that approach, and I believe that's where the fear comes from.
It's a great question. I actually think we're big enough we can walk and chew gum at the same time. So I think my view is the multilateral system was largely set up after World War II. Not all of it, but 80 or 90% was set up. And all of them were set up for a different reason. And a lot of them required American leadership. And I think we need to ride herd on those things. So I worked at the World Bank for a while, so I had a laissez-passer, which is a fancy diplomatic passport. And so I was in one of those institutions. And they're kind of underestimated and misunderstood in the United States because they don't really matter to us for the most part. They're kind of like, trivial entities. In a lot of the world, these people are treated, the heads of these organizations are treated as heads of state. If they say some pronouncement, something, they're treated as biblical truth. And they're very influential. Very, very important institutions. So I absolutely think, so the story I tell is, how much time do I have?
3 minutes.
Okay, so I'm going to do a 3-minute story. So the Trump administration, so a couple things. China today has more embassies than the United States has. That matters for a number of things. One of them is, and what's happened is because many people have studied abroad in China, they now, hundreds of thousands of millions of very capable, able people have started moving up in various multilateral organizations. They speak French, they speak English, they've studied abroad, they've studied in Switzerland or France, the US or Canada, elsewhere, and they're really resume perfect candidates. So let's say there's 130 of these. I wrote a report as to US leadership in the multilateral system. There's about 30 that are really important, that are called kind of the commanding heights of the multilateral, the IMF, the World Bank, Secretary General. Now then there's others like the International Chess and Checkers Association, I'm making it up. Like, I don't care who runs that, I would be happy to have the Russians run the International Chess and Checkers Association, that's about it. So some in between are kind of important, there's something called the FAO. Well, the FAO is the Food and Agriculture Organization. So they do a whole bunch of things, one of which is they figure, okay, there's some white beans here. Are those beans? How do I know those are beans? Well, someone has to say those are beans, right? Well, that seems like a stupid thing to talk about, but if you want to have global trade in beans, that counts as a bean, so what kind of tariff you get, or there's an association that does research in beans, and so you get access to the bean research money. And so there's a whole, and then there's like, the DNA is kept in some cloud somewhere at the FAO of those white beans. Okay. They also keep track of, okay, what's the most productive soil in Madagascar? Is it in East Overshoot County or West Overshoot County? So if you wanted to buy a lot of land, you probably want to know where the most productive soil is, right? Okay, so the Chinese Communist Party had a fabulous candidate, PhD in agricultural economics, spoke French and English, was a well-regarded person in international agriculture, running there as the head of the FAO. The Trump administration was like, well, the FAO cares. We had a person running the campaign who was not super duper competent. So the Chinese candidate got 120 votes, and the American-backed candidate got 12. That was the first time that happened. So there's a really interesting article. There's a website called Foreign Policy. So many of you probably read it, Foreign Policy. There's I'd say the most interesting article I've read in the last 10 years and anything in the foreign affairs world is the description of the election, of the FAO election. Outfoxed, the title's Outfoxed and Outgunned. Go ahead and read it. Outfoxed and Outgunned. So even the Trump administration was like, well, maybe they're not just useless, these multilateral organizations, the diplomats don't pay their parking tickets in New York and all that kind of stuff. They're like, oh, this didn't feel so good, we just had our teeth kicked in. So a friend of mine became the head of the US ambassador to Geneva, and he calls me and he says, I need a favor. I need you to help me run a campaign to find the right person to run something called WIPO. I'm like, what the hell is WIPO? And who knows what WIPO is here? Everyone know what WIPO is? Okay, this is a smart switched on group, right? I'm smart, you're all smart, you know what the hell WIPO is, I don't know what the hell WIPO is. It's basically the patent and trade system. So they keep files and files of intellectual property in a cloud computer. So if I invent a new straw, they got it in some cloud. So you can imagine that's pretty sensitive stuff, right? Well, guess what? Again, a fabulous candidate had worked his way up the system, a member of the Chinese Communist Party, spoke English and perfect French, was a patent lawyer, and had been in the system a long time, was ready to become the next head of WIPO. Yeah, there were sort of some concerns that maybe that's not such a good idea. I don't think I need to get into all the reasons why that might not be such a good idea. If you want me to go, I'll explain it, but anyways, the point is, even the Trump administration said, oh my word, we can't have that happen, and we're like, okay, now we need to take this seriously. The Biden administration is doing the same thing. So we need to mind the store, we need to lead in the multilateral system, We also need to be able to do things on a bilateral basis when we need to, and we need to be able to get some kind of credit for the sorts of stuff we do. That we need to be able to say, well, that was done by the United States. This was done, whether it's HIV/AIDS medicine or something else. I want people to know that the United States of America did X or Y, so we can do both.
Brother McNamara, succinctly as you always do. And then we're going to go to Michael Wong and we'll wrap it up.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Daniel, for another interesting conversation. For the students here, you explained how you got started after Dartmouth. What would you say to them to encourage them to prepare themselves for a career across administrations? And then my actual second question would be, it seems like as administrations move out of office, they start a foundation or a presidential library, and their influence maintains or continues after the administration is done there 4 years or 8 years. Thank you.
Okay, so I told the students they all need to learn a second language or a third language. They need to study abroad. I do think the other thing to think about is some of the other things that stood me well is learning to be a good writer. So whatever you're going to do, you need to be a good writer. So even if you're an engineer, if you're into STEM, so my kid's like into STEM, and he did some really highfalutin, complicated summer science project, and I can't understand a word of what the hell he did. So we need to explain to Earth people, like when you're doing technical stuff, you need to be able to act so Earth people need to understand your ideas. So being able to write clearly for smart people who may not be an expert in your area is a really important skill. So those three things. And I would say the other thing is have a big network. I don't breakfast or lunch alone almost ever. So I think you should go out of your way to start networking. If you don't have a LinkedIn website thing, you should do it. Even as a high school student, you should start one. And if you all want to link in with me, I'll say yes. Okay, so if you reach out to me, I'll say yes. Okay. And then all these, so there's the Clinton Foundation, there's the W Foundation, there's HW, there's the Reagan Library. My friend runs the Reagan Library. There's also, the Trump one's kind of an anomaly for a bunch of reasons I don't think I need to get into here. Obama has something, he's sort of also kind of not as active, but I mean, W is super active, HW was super active, and Clinton's been very active in a number of different ways. So yeah, and I think it's, it's not a bad model, and you're seeing it like Tony Blair has something called the Blair Initiative in the UK, and I've gotten to know him a little bit through it. Aznar, the former Prime Minister of Spain, who I greatly admire, he's not got his own thing, but he's super active. And I mean, Felipe Gonzalez, the former socialist prime minister in the 80s and 90s, also has been pretty active too. So it's true, and I think when people finish public service, they still have serving and contributing to do. And so that's why I also say I also work with I have a lot of non-resident affiliates, who are associated with the think tank, and they're often retirees. I call them as they're retiring. I say, you still have contributing to do, and I want you to join us and help us. So former heads of state are contributing to do.
We've got to get into UNC Charlotte. Michael Wong,
Get me to research on time.
Thank you, Daniel. My question is that what would be the ideal bilateral relationship that can maximize the U.S. national interests and also keep China happy?
That is excellent. Thank you very much. That's a great question. So there are a lot of smarter people than me who spend a lot of time. So Kevin Rudd, who you know who he is, he's the former Prime Minister of Australia. He's now the Australian ambassador to the U.S., and you should get him, if you haven't gotten Kevin Rudd to come speak. So I know him a little bit. I wouldn't say he's like my best friend, but he could pick me out of a police lineup. So Kevin Rudd has written, I think, a really important book about this. And so I think you want to get him to come talk about his book. He speaks Chinese, he greatly admires Chinese civilization, and he's a friend of China, and he's also a friend of the United States. And I think, so I've eschewed the term a second Cold War. So there's a lot of people in Washington calling this, I don't like the term. And I don't like the term because I think we could overshoot. I don't want to get into a shooting war with China. I don't think China wants to get into a shooting war with us. I actually think we need to find ways to we have commercial ties. The state of North Carolina has deep commercial ties. We have 20,000 Chinese students are studying in North Carolina. We do not have a problem with the Chinese people. and I keep saying that over and over again because I think we have to be careful about how we talk about this, and I have to be careful about how I talk about this. I personally try to be careful about how I talk about this. So, I think we need to find, so Kevin Rudd talks about having guardrails. I think we need to find ways of, I think as long as like mainland China doesn't invade Taiwan and we don't get into a shooting war, some kind of like miscalculation in some of the South China Sea, I think everything else is something we can figure out. I think we can work out almost everything else. I know I give the Biden administration credit because they're consistently trying. Maybe it's not seen that way in China, but we think we're trying to engage. Like they sent Jake Sullivan, who was a very smart guy. I've met him a couple of times. He doesn't know me super well, but like he went and met in Cyprus, I think, with somebody senior from the Chinese government about a month ago. They made that attempt in Alaska at the beginning. So I think we're always going to have differences. I think COVID has made our relations much harder. Much harder. I still think we need Americans studying in China. My 8th grader was like, maybe I should go. My oldest kid went, and he was like 8. My other kid went. My wife said, well, you've written all this stuff. What if they detain me or detain my kid? And I was like, no. So I don't think I'm that big of a deal, but like that's what went in our mind. And I think a lot of people who do business are now afraid. I think we have a problem where people are afraid. And I think some of it's, so I think we need to continue to have open channels of communication. I think ultimately, the way I've described it is, I think we need to go from sort of 5th gear. I think we need to have some system. We can't completely decouple. I think it's a fantasy to say we're going to be able to completely decouple. So we need to have ways of talking to each other. We need to have, I want lots of Chinese students coming here. It's very hard. It's harder for American students. I think American students have to be particularly brave. I think maybe some of the press is unfair, but some of it's probably true. And so I think we need to continue to have people to people. I think if Charlotte has a sister city in China, I would encourage the World Affairs Council to make a trip to China. When was the last time you guys did it? In the last 4 years? Okay, so it's harder now. I would encourage the World Affairs. So what you guys can do is the World Affairs Council of Charlotte should make a trip to China in the next 12 months. And you should, Wang, you should help with this, and you could help them.
Yeah,
And then I think
went
you should,
the last time.
right, but before pre-COVID. So I'm encouraged, what I'm saying is, there's been a constipation in travel. And so the World Affairs Council could do a world of good by sending a delegation to China now, and or visit the sister city. And then the sister city ought to send people now. There haven't been any travel since COVID. So if you said when would be the moment, it'd be right now. I would say right now is the moment. So I think we need to continue and deepen people to people because we're not talking enough up here. You have lots of ties. Folks here have lots of social capital here. They know the senators, they know members of Congress, they know the governor. These are serious people. You have ties to serious people in China. The thing this group could do now in the next 12 months is commit to make a trip. That would be my thought.